I told you to step away from the table. Victoria Langford's voice sliced through the soft music of the ballroom like a blade made of glass, sharp enough to stop conversations mid-sentence and turn dozens of curious faces toward the scene unfolding beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Manhattan Heritage Foundation Gala. The scent of expensive perfume and aged wine lingered in the air, mingling with the quiet tension that had begun to ripple through the crowd after the red wine spilled across Simone Carter's ivory silk dress. The stains spread slowly, dark and deliberate, like a mark meant to linger. Simone did not move immediately. She simply stood there, the stem of her untouched champagne flute still balanced between her fingers, her posture calm in a room suddenly filled with whispers. Around her, tuxedos and evening gowns shifted uneasily as guests exchanged glances. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked fascinated. A few lifted their phones slightly, not quite recording yet, but ready. Victoria Langford adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist with the casual confidence of someone who had never expected consequences in a room like this. Her voice carried easily through the ballroom again. Security does not like confusion at events like this, she added with a light laugh that sounded rehearsed. It is better if you just leave before someone has to escort you out. The words floated in the air, polished and cruel at the same time. Simone finally lowered her glass to the nearest cocktail table. She took a linen napkin from the tray of a passing waiter and pressed it lightly against the front of her dress. The wine stain did not disappear, but she did not seem concerned about that. Her expression remained composed, almost thoughtful, as if she were watching something much larger than a single moment unfold. Across the room, Emily Foster stood near the event registration desk, the tablet in her hands suddenly feeling heavier than it had a moment before. Emily had been coordinating charity galas for nearly 6 years. She had seen awkward conversations and minor disputes before. Wealthy donors sometimes disagreed about seating arrangements or auction bids. But this felt different. Her eyes moved from Victoria Langford to the woman standing quietly with the wine-stained dress. Something about Simone Carter felt familiar in a way Emily could not immediately place. Not because she had seen her at parties before. No, it was something else. A presence. A stillness that did not belong to someone who had just been publicly embarrassed. Emily tapped the screen of her tablet again, scanning the guest list for the 10th time in less than a minute. The name was still there. Carter. Simone Carter. The designation beside it read something unusual for an event like this. Executive Partner Access. Emily blinked slowly. Most donors had simple titles next to their names. Sponsor. Guest. Contributor. But Executive Partner Access appeared only 3 times on the entire guest list. Her eyes drifted back toward the center of the ballroom where the tension had begun to thicken like a storm cloud. Victoria Langford had not noticed Emily's sudden focus. She was too busy performing confidence for the crowd. Honestly, Victoria continued, her voice louder now as if addressing the entire ballroom. I do not understand why people insist on wandering into spaces that clearly are not meant for them. A few guests laughed politely. Others looked away, uncomfortable with the direction the moment had taken. Near the edge of the room, a young technology founder named Marcus Reed shifted his stance and folded his arms. Marcus had been invited to the gala because his company recently partnered with a philanthropic venture tied to the Langford Family Foundation. He had arrived expecting polite networking and predictable speeches about education grants. Instead, he found himself watching a social test unfold in real time. Marcus glanced again at Simone Carter. Her calm unsettled him. Most people would have protested or walked away by now. She did neither. Instead, she reached slowly into the small black clutch resting at her side and removed her phone. The motion was quiet, almost invisible beneath the soft lighting of the ballroom. She tapped the screen once. Victoria noticed the movement and raised an eyebrow. Recording this will not help you, she said, tilting her head slightly. It will only make the exit more awkward. Simone lifted her gaze for the first time since the wine had been poured. Her eyes met Victoria's with a steadiness that did not belong to someone seeking permission. When she spoke, her voice was measured and clear enough to carry through the crowd without effort. Angela, she said into the phone, pause the Langford infrastructure review for a moment. The words were simple, but something about them made Marcus Reed's eyebrows rise slightly. Across the ballroom, Emily Foster felt her pulse jump. Infrastructure review. Langford. Her fingers moved across the tablet screen again, pulling up the sponsor partnership files linked to the gala's donor network. There it was. The Langford Capital Urban Transit Initiative. Estimated value, $2.4 billion. Primary development partner, Carter Infrastructure Group. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the connection formed in her mind with sudden clarity. Her gaze snapped back towards Simone Carter. The woman standing quietly beneath the chandelier was not simply a guest at the charity gala. She was the chief executive officer of the company funding the largest project Langford Capital had announced in a decade. But the rest of the room had not reached that conclusion yet. Victoria Langford certainly had not. She crossed her arms and let out a short laugh. "Angela," she repeated mockingly, "is that your ride home?" A ripple of amusement moved through a small cluster of guests standing near her. Simone did not respond to the joke. Instead, she listened quietly as a calm voice came through her phone. No one else could hear the words clearly, but the tone was professional and attentive. Simone nodded slightly. "Yes," she said. "Please place the contract status under executive review until I confirm the next step." Across the ballroom, Emily Foster's tablet screen refreshed again as the partnership file updated automatically. The status indicator beside the Langford project shifted from active negotiation to executive review pending. Emily stared at the screen as if it had suddenly become a live wire. Marcus Reed noticed her reaction and stepped closer. "Something wrong?" he asked quietly. Emily hesitated for a moment before answering. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "The project Langford Capital announced last quarter," she said. "The transit redevelopment contract." Marcus nodded. $2.4 billion, he replied. Emily swallowed slowly. The funding partner just paused it. Marcus followed her gaze back toward the center of the ballroom. Victoria Langford was still speaking, unaware that the ground beneath her family's largest deal had already begun to shift. Simone Carter slipped the phone back into her clutch and lifted the napkin from her dress. The wine stain remained, but her expression carried the faintest hint of something new now. Not anger, not embarrassment, something closer to quiet resolution. Around them, the music of the string quartet continued to play, soft and elegant, as if the room itself had not yet realized that a single decision had already begun to change the direction of a $2.4 billion future. "I think you should leave now." The voice came from a man standing near the center aisle of the ballroom, and the words landed softly but clearly enough to quiet the low ripple of conversations that had begun spreading through the room. The speaker was tall, sharply dressed, and carried the easy confidence of someone used to controlling rooms like this one. Daniel Langford had finally stepped forward. Until that moment, he had been speaking with two investors near the private bar, unaware that his sister had turned a quiet charity gala into the center of a growing spectacle. But the shifting attention in the room had drawn him in, and now the older Langford stood a few feet away from the woman whose wine-stained dress had already become the unspoken focus of the entire evening. Victoria Langford exhaled in visible relief the moment she saw her brother approaching. "Daniel, finally," she said, gesturing toward Simone with a dismissive flick of her hand. This woman wandered in and started making things awkward for everyone. Daniel's eyes moved calmly from Victoria to Simone Carter. For a moment, he simply studied the scene. The wine stain. The quiet circle of guests watching. The phones now lifted a little higher by several curious onlookers. Daniel had built Langford Capital on a reputation for reading rooms quickly, and what he saw here did not fit the narrative Victoria was offering him. The woman standing in front of them did not look confused. She did not look embarrassed. If anything, she looked like the only person in the room who already understood how the next 10 minutes were going to unfold. Daniel gave a polite but firm smile. "I am sure there has been a misunderstanding," he said, his tone practiced and diplomatic. "But this event is invitation only." Simone Carter met his gaze without hesitation. "I am aware," she replied calmly. The simplicity of the response caused several nearby guests to glance at one another. Daniel continued, maintaining the controlled patience of someone used to managing delicate moments in public spaces. "Then perhaps it would be easier for everyone if we resolved this quietly," he said. "Security can help escort you to the lobby and sort out the invitation issue." The word escort hung in the air like a carefully polished threat. Victoria folded her arms again, satisfied. "Exactly," she said. "Thank you." But before anyone else could move, Marcus Reed stepped slightly closer to the scene. He had not planned to involve himself in anything tonight. Marcus had come to network, shake hands, and leave with a few new business cards. Yet the longer he watched the woman standing calmly beneath the chandelier lights, the more something about the situation felt wrong. He glanced toward Emily Foster across the ballroom. Emily was staring at her tablet screen with the expression of someone who had just discovered a sentence in a contract that changed everything. Marcus frowned slightly and turned his attention back to Simone Carter. She had not reacted to Daniel's suggestion. Instead, she seemed to be studying the room itself, as if quietly measuring how far the moment had already traveled. Guests were no longer pretending to ignore the confrontation. Conversations had stopped entirely in the nearby sections of the ballroom. The string quartet continued playing, but even the musicians appeared to sense the tension threading through the room. Emily Foster finally took a step forward. She had spent her career making sure events like this ran smoothly. Coordinators were trained to fix problems quietly before they reached the stage. But this was no longer a problem she could quietly adjust. Her heart pounded as she crossed the marble floor toward the Langford siblings. "Daniel," she said carefully when she reached them. Daniel turned toward her with mild surprise. "Emily, yes," he said. "We are just handling a small issue." Emily swallowed once. "Sir, I believe there may be some confusion," she said. Victoria sighed loudly. "Of course there is confusion," she replied. "That is what happens when people enter spaces they were not invited to." Emily did not look at Victoria. Her attention remained fixed on Daniel. "The guest standing here is registered under executive partner access," she said quietly. Daniel's expression shifted by a fraction. "And?" he asked. Emily hesitated, aware that the entire nearby crowd was listening now. "And the system indicates that the executive partner connected to that designation is Carter Infrastructure Group." For the first time, Daniel Langford's composure faltered. The name settled in the air with a subtle "Wait." Victoria rolled her eyes. "I do not see what that has to do with anything," she said. Daniel did not respond immediately. Instead, his eyes returned to Simone Carter with a sharper focus than before. "Carter Infrastructure," he repeated slowly. Simone nodded once. "Yes," she said. Victoria laughed again, this time with a hint of irritation. "Daniel, please," she said. "You are not going to entertain this." But Daniel was no longer listening to his sister. His mind was moving quickly through numbers, contracts, and announcements from the previous quarter. Carter Infrastructure Group had been mentioned in the internal reports connected to the city transit redevelopment proposal Langford Capital was preparing to finalize. The value of that contract was $2.4 billion. Daniel knew the number well because he had spent months negotiating it. His voice dropped slightly as he addressed Simone again. "You said earlier that you paused a review," he said carefully. Simone's expression remained calm. "Yes," she replied. "A preliminary review." The guests closest to the conversation exchanged confused glances. They could sense that something important had just entered the room, but they could not yet see the full shape of it. Emily Foster's tablet vibrated lightly in her hands again. She looked down and felt her stomach drop. The status indicator beside the Langford Transit project had updated again. Executive review pending had just changed to contract suspension. Marcus Reed leaned closer to see the screen. "What does that mean?" he whispered. Emily answered quietly. "It means the funding partner just froze the deal." Marcus looked back toward Simone Carter with new understanding forming behind his eyes. Victoria Langford noticed the shift in Daniel's posture and frowned. "What is happening?" she demanded. Daniel did not answer right away. His attention remained fixed on Simone. "I believe introductions may be in order," he said slowly. Simone lifted the napkin from her dress and placed it gently on the table beside her champagne glass. The stain of red wine remained visible beneath the chandelier light, but she did not seem concerned by it. She looked around the ballroom once more. Nearly every guest was watching now. When she spoke again, her voice carried easily through the silent room. "My name is Simone Carter," she said. A murmur moved through the crowd as the name landed. Some guests recognized it instantly. Others did not. But Daniel Langford certainly did. The realization crossed his face like the moment a businessman sees a contract clause he wishes he had read more carefully. Simone continued calmly. "And I am the Chief Executive Officer of Carter Infrastructure Group." The silence that followed felt heavier than the music still playing softly in the background. Victoria Langford stared at her for a long moment, the confidence draining slowly from her expression as the truth of the situation began to assemble itself piece by piece. Around them, dozens of guests stood perfectly still, sensing that the quiet woman with the wine-stained dress had just shifted the balance of power in a room full of people who had assumed they understood exactly who belonged there. "I think we need to slow down for a moment." Daniel Langford's voice no longer carried the smooth certainty it had held only seconds earlier. The words were still calm, still polished, but the shift was unmistakable to anyone standing close enough to read the room. The billionaire investor who had walked into the conversation expecting to remove an inconvenience was now facing a reality he had not prepared for. The ballroom felt different now. The soft music from the string quartet continued drifting through the air, but it sounded distant, almost unreal, as if the entire room had stepped slightly outside the evening's carefully planned script. Simone Carter remained exactly where she had been standing since the wine touched her dress. Her posture had not changed. Her hands rested loosely near the edge of the cocktail table beside her champagne glass. The red stain on the ivory silk had begun to darken as the fabric absorbed the liquid, but she seemed almost unaware of it. Instead, she watched Daniel Langford with quiet patience, giving him the same measured attention one executive might give another during the opening seconds of a negotiation. Around them, the guests had stopped pretending this was a passing moment. People who had been chatting near the bar now stood completely still. Several donors had moved closer without realizing they had done so. Phones were no longer half-hidden. A few were openly recording. Others were simply held in place as their owners tried to understand how a charity gala had suddenly turned into the center of a corporate decision worth billions of dollars. Victoria Langford was the last person in the room to accept what had just been said. She stared at Simone Carter, as if the words Chief Executive Officer of Carter Infrastructure Group were a strange joke she had not yet decided to laugh at. "That is not possible," Victoria said finally, the confidence in her voice thinning just slightly. Simone did not respond immediately. She simply tilted her head a fraction, the faintest sign that she had heard the objection and considered it unnecessary. Daniel raised a hand toward his sister without looking at her, a quiet signal asking for silence. His mind was working quickly now, assembling pieces that had not seemed connected 10 minutes earlier. Carter Infrastructure had entered the transit redevelopment conversation late in the negotiations, but once the firm joined the project, the entire financial structure had changed. Their engineering capacity and capital guarantees had allowed Langford Capital to present the proposal to the city council with a level of confidence that none of the other bidders could match. Without Carter Infrastructure, the proposal was simply an expensive plan on paper. Daniel looked again at the woman standing in front of him. The wine stain on her dress suddenly felt like a symbol no one in the room could ignore. "Miss Carter," he said carefully, choosing each word as if it were part of a contract clause, "I believe there may have been a misunderstanding between my sister and yourself." A few guests near the back of the crowd exchanged quiet glances at the change in tone. Only minutes ago, the Langford name had carried the authority in the conversation. Now Daniel sounded like a man trying to repair a fragile bridge before it collapsed. Simone's expression did not change. "A misunderstanding usually requires two people to misunderstand something," she said calmly. The line moved through the crowd like a ripple across still water. Marcus Reed folded his arms again, watching the exchange with growing fascination. He had attended dozens of networking events over the years, but he had never witnessed a moment when social status shifted so quickly in the open. Emily Foster still held her tablet against her chest, her heart beating faster with every second. She knew exactly what the updated contract status meant. Executive review could become reinstatement, but it could also become termination. The difference between those two outcomes rested entirely in the hands of the woman standing quietly in front. Of the Langford siblings, Victoria finally found her voice again. "This is ridiculous," she said sharply. "Even if you work for that company, it does not change the fact that you caused a disruption here tonight." Simone turned her head slowly toward her. The look was not angry. It was almost curious, the way someone might observe a statement that revealed more about the speaker than the situation itself. "Did I cause the disruption?" Simone asked. Victoria opened her mouth, but did not answer immediately. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, as if hoping the question might dissolve before his sister attempted to respond. But Victoria Langford had never been known for retreating once she had chosen a direction. You walked into an event where you clearly did not belong, she said. And you started making phone calls. A quiet murmur moved through the crowd again. Several guests were beginning to piece together the timeline in their own minds. Simone Carter had not raised her voice. She had not insulted anyone. She had simply made a phone call. Simone rested her fingertips lightly against the edge of the table. This event was listed on the partner invitation registry connected to the transit project, she said. So I attended. Daniel's shoulders lowered slightly as the truth of that sentence settled in. The invitation registry had been handled by his foundation team. Carter Infrastructure had been automatically included because of their financial role in the redevelopment plan. Victoria, however, had not been part of that process. She had simply seen a woman she did not recognize and made a decision based on assumption. Marcus Reed noticed Daniel's expression change again. It was the look of someone realizing that a simple mistake had already begun producing consequences. Simone continued speaking, her voice calm enough that the entire ballroom leaned closer to hear it. I believe your sister said earlier that people should dress like they belong in rooms like this, she said. Victoria shifted uncomfortably, but did not interrupt. Simone glanced down briefly at the wine stain on her dress. This dress was made in Chicago, she said. The fabric was woven in North Carolina. The engineering firm that designed the train platforms in our redevelopment proposal employs more than 800 workers in Detroit. Most of them wear clothing that looks exactly like this when they attend events. The statement was not loud, but its meaning filled the room. Marcus Reed watched Daniel Langford absorb the words carefully. The billionaire investor understood public perception better than most people in the building. He knew exactly how quickly a single recorded moment could travel through business networks and news outlets. Daniel cleared his throat quietly. Miss Carter, he said again, I would like to apologize on behalf of my family for any disrespect that may have occurred this evening. The apology landed with the careful precision of a strategic move. Several guests nodded slightly, as if expecting the moment to resolve itself there. But Simone Carter did not immediately accept it. Instead, she reached into her clutch once more and removed her phone. She did not dial a number. She simply checked the screen as if reviewing a message that had just arrived. Emily Foster's tablet vibrated again at exactly the same moment. She looked down and felt her breath catch for the second time that night. The contract status had updated again. Contract suspension had just been replaced by formal withdrawal pending confirmation. Emily lifted her eyes slowly towards Simone Carter, understanding that the decision was no longer theoretical. Simone slipped the phone back into her clutch and returned her attention to Daniel Langford. Apologies are useful when they arrive before decisions are made, she said quietly. The words hung in the air long enough for everyone in the room to understand what they meant. Victoria Langford stared at her brother in disbelief as the realization finally reached her. What had started as a small social humiliation had already grown into something far larger. And for the first time that evening, the room understood that the quiet woman standing beneath the chandelier lights was no longer simply responding to what had happened. She was deciding what would happen next. I think we both understand that the room has already changed, Simone Carter said quietly, her voice calm enough that it did not need to rise above the low hum of the string quartet, yet strong enough that every guest standing within 30 feet heard the words clearly. The chandelier light reflected softly against the polished marble floor while the silence around the cocktail tables deepened. Daniel Langford stood still for a moment, absorbing the sentence the way an experienced negotiator studies the first unexpected clause in a contract. It was not simply what she said. It was how she said it. There was no anger in her tone, no urgency, just certainty, the kind that appears when someone already knows the outcome of a decision before the other side realizes there was a decision to be made at all. Victoria Langford shifted beside her brother, the diamond bracelet on her wrist catching the light as she crossed her arms again. But the gesture no longer carried the same confidence it had a few minutes earlier. Around the ballroom, the atmosphere had quietly transformed. Conversations had stopped entirely now. People who had arrived expecting polite speeches and charity auction bids found themselves standing in small circles of silence, watching a negotiation unfold that none of them had anticipated witnessing. Near the edge of the room, Marcus Reed leaned against a high cocktail table, his eyes moving between Simone and Daniel, as if watching two chess players approaching the middle of a match, where one of them had already calculated the final moves. Emily Foster stood a few steps behind him, her tablet still in her hands, though she had stopped pretending to review anything on the screen. She had coordinated dozens of galas over the years, but she had never watched a moment where the balance of an entire evening shifted so completely in under 10 minutes. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice slower now, more deliberate. "Miss Carter, I believe we should discuss this privately," he said, glancing briefly toward the guests who had formed a quiet circle around the conversation. Simone followed his gaze across the room. A few people quickly lowered their phones, pretending they had not been recording anything. Others did not bother hiding it. The moment had already grown larger than the ballroom. She looked back at Daniel with the faintest trace of understanding in her expression. "You prefer privacy," she said. Daniel did not answer immediately, but the meaning of his request was obvious. Public embarrassment had never been part of the Langford strategy. Their influence depended on maintaining the appearance that every negotiation remained under control. Simone rested one hand lightly on the edge of the table again, her fingertips touching the glass surface beside her champagne flute. "Your sister seemed comfortable making the conversation public a few minutes ago," she said calmly. Victoria inhaled sharply, but Daniel raised a hand again before she could respond. The billionaire investor knew better than to argue with that observation. The wine stain on Simone's dress was still visible beneath the chandelier light, a quiet reminder of how the moment had started. Daniel adjusted the cuff of his jacket as he considered his next words. "Then allow me to correct the situation in the same room where it began," he said. The line carried the tone of a man attempting to reclaim authority without appearing desperate. Several guests exchanged glances again, recognizing the shift in language. Daniel was no longer dismissing the situation. He was negotiating with it. Simone tilted her head slightly, acknowledging the effort. "That would be appropriate," she replied. For a few seconds no one spoke. The pause stretched long enough for the quiet tension to travel through the ballroom again like a slow-moving current. The musicians continued playing softly, but even their bows seemed to move more carefully now. Daniel looked directly at Simone Carter. "Carter Infrastructure is an essential partner in the transit redevelopment proposal," he said. "Without your firm's engineering capacity and capital commitment, the project cannot move forward." The statement was not new information for Simone. She had helped structure the financing framework herself. But hearing Daniel Langford say the words in front of the entire room carried its own significance. Marcus Reed noticed the subtle shift in posture among several investors standing nearby. Until that moment, many of them had assumed the Langford family controlled the direction of the redevelopment plan. Now it was clear the power structure was more complicated. Simone did not rush her reply. She glanced briefly toward Emily Foster, whose tablet screen still displayed the updated contract status. Then she returned her attention to Daniel. "Your proposal depended on our structural engineering division, our transportation logistics team, and our capital guarantees," she said calmly. Daniel nodded once. "Yes," he said. Simone continued, her tone still steady. "Which means the proposal also depended on our confidence in the partnership." The word confidence lingered in the air. Victoria Langford looked from her brother back to Simone as if trying to understand when the evening had moved beyond her control. "You cannot seriously be considering canceling the entire project over a social misunderstanding," Victoria said. The sentence sounded bold at first, but it carried the edge of uncertainty now. Simone turned toward her slowly. "I am considering whether the partnership reflects the values required to manage a project that will affect millions of commuters every day," she replied. The room fell silent again. Several guests who had arrived as donors now realized they were witnessing something far more significant than a disagreement between two people at a party. This was the moment where a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure deal could change direction based on how a company chose to represent itself in public. Daniel Langford exhaled slowly, the way someone might do when accepting that the negotiation had moved into deeper territory than expected. "Miss Carter," he said, "I believe you understand the scale of what we are building together." Simone met his gaze again. "I understand it very well," she replied. The quiet confidence in her voice made it clear she had spent far more time thinking about the long-term consequences of the project than anyone else in the room. Marcus Reed watched the exchange with fascination. He had built his own technology company from a small apartment office into a venture-backed enterprise worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But even he had never seen someone hold a room like this without raising their voice. Simone Carter had not shouted. She had not threatened. Yet every person standing beneath the chandelier lights understood that the next sentence she spoke could change the direction of a $2.4 billion future. Emily Foster glanced at her tablet again. The contract status indicator had not changed since the last update. Formal withdrawal pending confirmation remained on the screen like a quiet countdown. Simone looked around the ballroom one more time, taking in the faces of donors, investors, and guests who had come expecting a predictable evening of speeches and photographs. The project will shape transportation across 3 counties for the next 40 years, she said slowly. It deserves partners who understand what it means to build something that lasts. Her voice remained calm, but the meaning was unmistakable. Daniel Langford knew exactly what she was saying without her needing to say it directly. Partnerships of that scale depended on trust. And trust was rarely built in rooms where respect could disappear as quickly as a glass of wine tipped in the wrong direction. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was heavy with understanding. Everyone in the room could feel that the decision was no longer hypothetical. The quiet woman standing beside the cocktail table had already begun measuring the cost of continuing the partnership against the message it would send if she walked away. I believe the question tonight is not only about a contract, Simone Carter said quietly, her voice carrying through the ballroom with the same calm steadiness that had slowly taken control of the room. The words did not sound dramatic. Yet every guest standing beneath the crystal chandeliers felt their weight. The charity gala had begun hours earlier with polite conversations and polite applause, but now the evening had shifted into something none of the donors or investors had expected. Conversations had stopped entirely. The quiet hum of the string quartet floated through the room like background noise in a moment that had grown far larger than the music. Daniel Langford remained standing across from Simone Carter, his posture composed, but his attention sharper now, the way a seasoned investor studies a market after realizing a single decision could change the value of everything connected to it. Victoria Langford stood beside him, the confident smile she had worn earlier now replaced by something more uncertain, though she still refused to step back from the position she had created for herself. Around them, the circle of guests had grown slightly wider as more people drifted closer without fully realizing they were doing it. Marcus Reed stood near one of the tall cocktail tables, watching carefully as if observing a boardroom negotiation unfolding in real time rather than a disagreement at a social event. Emily Foster remained near the edge of the group with her tablet in both hands, though her attention was no longer on the screen. She had seen the contract status change twice already that evening, and she understood that the next change might end the partnership entirely. Simone Carter glanced briefly at the wine stain still visible across the front of her dress. The fabric had begun to dry, the dark red color fading slightly under the ballroom lights, but the mark remained clear enough for everyone to see. She lifted her gaze again toward Daniel Langford. Projects like the one we discussed with the city council are not built only with steel and concrete, she continued. They are built with trust between the people who stand behind them. The room remained silent. Daniel nodded slowly. He understood the language she was using. Trust was a word that appeared frequently in investor presentations and partnership agreements. But in this moment, it meant something much simpler. It meant how people treated one another when they believed no one important was watching. Victoria shifted again beside him. This is being exaggerated, she said, trying to recover the certainty she had carried earlier. A drink spilled at a party does not define the character of an entire company. Simone looked at her calmly. A drink spilling does not, she replied. But the reason it spilled can reveal more than people expect. The sentence landed softly, yet it echoed through the room with unmistakable clarity. Several guests exchanged quiet glances again. The meaning was difficult to ignore. Daniel Langford drew a slow breath before speaking again. Miss Carter, he said carefully, our partnership discussions with your firm have always been conducted with professionalism and respect. Simone inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement. Yes, she said. They have. For a moment, the two executives simply studied one another across the small distance between them, the way experienced negotiators sometimes do when they both understand that the conversation has reached a point where every word matters. Marcus Reed watched the exchange closely. He had seen investors argue about technology acquisitions and venture funding rounds before, but this moment felt different. Neither Simone nor Daniel raised their voices. Yet the tension in the room felt stronger than most corporate disputes he had witnessed. Emily Foster shifted her weight slightly as she continued to observe. The contract status on her tablet still read formal withdrawal pending confirmation. The system would not change again until someone authorized the next step. Simone Carter turned her attention briefly toward the guests gathered around them. "Many of you here tonight are donors to the foundation hosting this event," she said calmly. "You support programs that promise opportunity and progress." Several people nodded almost automatically. That was exactly how the evening had been advertised. Simone continued, her voice steady and thoughtful. "The redevelopment project we propose together will shape transportation across this region for decades. It will determine how workers reach their jobs, how families move through their communities, and how businesses grow around the new transit lines." Daniel Langford listened carefully. He had delivered nearly identical speeches during investor meetings over the past 6 months. Yet hearing those words spoken now in this setting changed the tone entirely. "When a company chooses partners for something of that scale," Simone said, "it must consider more than financial projections." The guests standing nearby leaned slightly closer without realizing they were doing it. The ballroom had become so quiet that the soft clink of a glass being set on a nearby table sounded unusually loud. Victoria Langford shook her head, her patience beginning to fray. "You are turning a simple misunderstanding into a public lecture," she said sharply. Simone's expression did not change. "I am explaining how decisions are made," she replied. The calm certainty in her voice made the difference between the two women impossible to ignore. Marcus Reed glanced at Daniel Langford again. The billionaire investor had not interrupted Simone once since she began speaking. Instead, he seemed to be measuring each sentence the way he might analyze the terms of a contract before signing it. Finally, Daniel spoke again. "What exactly are you suggesting we do at this moment?" he asked. Simone Carter answered without hesitation. "I am considering whether Carter Infrastructure should continue participating in the redevelopment partnership," she said. The statement settled into the room like a weight placed carefully on a table. Even the guests who had only been half paying attention earlier now stood completely still. Marcus Reed exhaled slowly through his nose, recognizing the significance of the sentence immediately. Emily Foster's eyes drifted once more to the screen of her tablet. The words "formal withdrawal pending confirmation" remained unchanged. Daniel Langford folded his hands loosely in front of him, a gesture of controlled patience. "You are prepared to reconsider a project valued at $2.4 billion because of a single interaction at a social event," he said. Simone looked directly at him. "I am prepared to reconsider whether the partnership reflects the principles required to manage a project that large," she replied. The clarity of her answer left little room for misinterpretation. Around them, several investors whispered quietly among themselves. They had arrived expecting speeches about charitable giving. Instead, they were watching the early stages of a corporate decision that could reshape an entire infrastructure proposal. Victoria Langford's voice rose again, though this time it carried more frustration than authority. "This is absurd," she said. "You cannot possibly believe one moment like this represents our entire organization." Simone studied her for a moment before responding. "Moments often reveal what policies attempt to hide," she said calmly. The sentence hung in the air long enough for several guests to nod subtly. Daniel Langford glanced briefly toward the phones held by a few people near the back of the room. He understood that the situation was no longer contained within the ballroom. If this conversation continued much longer, the story would travel far beyond the event itself. Simone Carter rested her hand lightly on the table beside her glass again. Her voice remained steady when she spoke once more. "But I have not finalized the decision yet," she said. The room seemed to breathe again at those words. Daniel Langford's expression sharpened slightly with renewed focus. "Then perhaps we still have time to address the concern," he replied. Simone met his gaze with quiet clarity. "Perhaps," she said. The single word carried a calm finality that made it clear the next moments would determine far more than the outcome of an uncomfortable evening at a charity gala. I believe you said earlier that the decision was not final yet, Daniel Langford said slowly, his voice carrying through the ballroom, with the careful restraint of someone who understood that every word now mattered more than the last. The quiet statement seemed to settle into the room like a stone placed gently into still water, sending subtle ripples through the circle of guests gathered around the conversation. Simone Carter remained standing beside the cocktail table, where her untouched champagne glass reflected the chandelier light above. The deep red stain across her dress had dried further now, the edges of the mark faint, but still unmistakable under the glow of the ballroom. She looked at Daniel for a moment before responding, her expression composed in the same calm way it had been since the moment the wine had spilled. "That is correct," she said. The simple answer caused a subtle shift in posture among several people in the room. Investors who had been quietly calculating the implications of the contract withdrawal now realized that the outcome had not yet been sealed. Marcus Reed leaned forward slightly from where he stood near the tall table, folding his arms as he watched the exchange with the focused curiosity of an entrepreneur who had spent years studying negotiations between powerful companies. Emily Foster held her tablet closer to her chest, the screen still, displaying the contract status that had turned the entire evening into something far more serious than a charity event. Formal withdrawal pending confirmation remained unchanged. The system waited for a final instruction. Daniel Langford glanced briefly at the guests standing behind Simone before returning his attention to her. "Then I would like the opportunity to address the concern directly," he said. Simone tilted her head slightly. "You already apologized," she replied calmly. The statement was not dismissive. It was simply factual. Daniel nodded once. "Yes," he said, "but an apology without action is rarely useful in business." A quiet murmur passed through the surrounding guests. The line carried the tone of a seasoned executive who understood that public situations sometimes required more than polite words. Victoria Langford exhaled sharply beside him. "Daniel," she said quietly, though the irritation in her voice was impossible to miss. "This is unnecessary." Daniel did not look at her when he answered. "Actually," he said, "it is very necessary." The difference between the two siblings became clear in that moment. Victoria still viewed the situation as a social embarrassment. Daniel had already begun seeing it as a corporate risk. Simone watched the exchange between them with quiet attention. She had spent years negotiating with investors and municipal leaders. She recognized the moment when someone shifted from pride to pragmatism. Daniel took a step forward, not aggressively but deliberately, closing a small part of the distance between them. "Carter Infrastructure joined our redevelopment proposal because the project represented an opportunity to improve transportation for millions of people," he said. "You did not join because of my family's name or reputation." Simone gave a small nod. "No," she said. "We joined because the engineering framework was sound and the community impact was meaningful." Daniel allowed a faint breath of acknowledgement to escape him. "Then I believe we should focus on that purpose rather than allowing one moment to dismantle months of planning." The argument was logical. Several investors standing near the back of the group nodded slightly, as if recognizing the reasoning. But Simone Carter did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked around the ballroom again, studying the faces of the people who had gathered to watch the conversation unfold. Some looked curious. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked deeply invested in the outcome. Marcus Reed noticed that she was not simply looking at them. She was measuring something. When Simone finally spoke again, her voice was thoughtful rather than confrontational. "You are correct that the project matters," she said, "which is exactly why the partnership behind it must matter just as much." The sentence hung quietly in the air. Daniel did not interrupt. He knew she was not finished. Simone continued. "When companies agree to build something that will affect an entire region, they are not simply sharing resources," she said. "They are sharing responsibility for how that project reflects the values of the people funding it." Victoria shifted again beside her brother, though this time she remained silent. The room listened. The musicians continued playing in the background, but the music felt almost secondary to the quiet negotiation taking place in front of the ballroom. Simone glanced once more at the wine stain on her dress. She touched the edge of the fabric lightly, not with anger but with a kind of reflective calm. "Earlier this evening," she said, "your sister told me that people should dress like they belong in rooms like this." The words brought an uneasy ripple through the crowd. Victoria's posture stiffened. Simone lifted her eyes again toward Daniel. Moments like that reveal something important about how organizations see the world around them, she said. Daniel's expression remained controlled, but he understood exactly what she meant. Corporate culture was not defined only by mission statements or charitable donations. It was revealed through everyday behavior. Marcus Reed noticed the way several investors in the room shifted their stance again, quietly reassessing the dynamic between the two companies. Daniel finally spoke again. If you believe the culture of our organization does not reflect the standards required for the partnership, then we must address that directly, he said. Simone watched him carefully. How would you propose doing that? She asked. The question was simple, but it carried weight. Emily Foster looked down at her tablet again. The system still waited for confirmation. Daniel took a slow breath before answering. First, he said, by acknowledging that what happened tonight was unacceptable. He paused briefly, then turned slightly toward the room. And by making it clear that respect is not optional within any organization connected to our projects. The statement was deliberate enough that several guests nodded quietly. But Simone's expression remained thoughtful rather than convinced. She waited. Daniel looked back at her. Second, he continued, by demonstrating that our partnership decisions are guided by accountability, not by status. The word accountability seemed to carry more weight than the rest of the sentence. Marcus Reed raised an eyebrow slightly, recognizing the shift in tone. This was no longer simply about saving a contract. Daniel Langford was trying to redefine the narrative of the evening. Simone Carter studied him for another long moment. The ballroom remained completely still as everyone waited to see how she would respond. Finally, she spoke again. Accountability, she repeated quietly. Daniel nodded once. Yes. Simone glanced again toward Emily's tablet screen across the room. The words formal withdrawal pending confirmation still glowed softly on the display. Then she looked back at Daniel Langford. Her voice remained calm when she spoke again, but the meaning of her next sentence caused the room to grow even quieter. Then perhaps the next step will determine whether this partnership moves forward or becomes an example of why it should not. The lines settled into the air like a decision waiting to be completed, and every person in the ballroom understood that the evening had reached the moment where actions would matter far more than explanations. I believe you said the next step would determine whether the partnership moves forward, Daniel Langford said quietly, the controlled weight of his voice settling over the room like the final note of the string quartet that now seemed to drift somewhere far behind the tension in the ballroom. Simone Carter stood calmly beneath the chandelier light, her posture unchanged, her hands resting lightly near the edge of the cocktail table where the untouched champagne glass reflected the soft gold glow above. The red stain across the front of her dress remained visible, though the edges had faded slightly as the fabric dried, leaving behind a quiet reminder of how the evening had begun. Around them the crowd had grown larger without anyone announcing it. Guests who had once gathered near the bar or the silent auction tables had slowly drifted closer, forming a loose circle of quiet attention. Conversations had stopped entirely now. Even the waitstaff moved more carefully, aware that the room had shifted from a social event into something closer to a corporate crossroads. Marcus Reed leaned against the tall cocktail table where he had been standing for several minutes, his eyes moving between Simone and Daniel with the same focus he used when studying a potential acquisition. Emily Foster still held her tablet in both hands, the screen glowing softly with the contract status that had already changed the course of the evening once before. Formal withdrawal pending confirmation still remained on the display, waiting for a final instruction that had not yet been given. Simone looked at Daniel for a long moment before speaking again. Yes, she said calmly. The single word seemed to travel through the quiet space like a small signal that something important was about to happen next. Daniel nodded slowly. The billionaire investor had spent decades navigating negotiations worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but he understood that this moment carried a different kind of pressure. Financial numbers could be debated. Reputation could not be recalculated as easily. Victoria Langford shifted beside him, her expression tightening slightly as the silence continued to stretch. She had not expected the evening to evolve into a public negotiation about corporate values and accountability. For her, the situation still felt like a social misunderstanding that had somehow grown beyond control. Daniel, she said under her breath, though the nearby guests could still hear her. We are not seriously continuing this conversation in front of everyone. Daniel did not immediately answer her. Instead, he looked at Simone Carter again with careful focus. You said earlier that accountability would determine the future of the partnership, he said. Simone inclined her head slightly. Yes, she replied. Daniel took a slow breath before continuing. Then allow me to demonstrate exactly what accountability looks like within our organization. The sentence carried a quiet firmness that caused several people in the crowd to glance at one another again. Marcus Reed raised an eyebrow slightly. Something about Daniel's tone suggested that the next moment might shift the direction of the conversation entirely. Simone did not interrupt. She simply watched. Daniel turned slightly toward his sister. Victoria noticed the movement and stiffened almost immediately. Daniel, she said again, more sharply this time. What exactly are you doing? Daniel met her gaze for a moment before answering. His voice was calm, but unmistakably serious. Correcting a mistake before it becomes a permanent one, he said. Victoria stared at him as if trying to determine whether he was joking. But the look in his eyes made it clear that he was not. The surrounding guests had grown. Even quieter now, sensing that the conversation was about to move beyond explanation into action. Emily Foster glanced down at her tablet again, as if instinctively preparing for another change in the contract status. Daniel Langford turned back towards Simone Carter. You are correct about something, he said. Projects of this scale require trust between the people responsible for building them. Simone remained still, listening. Daniel continued. And trust is built on the understanding that every person connected to the project represents the values of the organization behind it. The words were carefully chosen. Each one measured the way an experienced executive constructs a public statement. Marcus Reed noticed that Daniel was no longer speaking only to Simone. He was speaking to the entire room. Daniel paused briefly before finishing the thought. Which means the actions of my own family cannot be separated from the reputation of the company leading the proposal. The sentence settled into the air with quiet force. Victoria Langford's eyes widened slightly as the meaning began to form in her mind. Daniel, she said again, her voice tightening with disbelief. But Daniel raised a hand gently, signaling for her to stop. Simone Carter watched the exchange without interruption. She had seen moments like this before in boardrooms where powerful people were forced to decide whether loyalty or responsibility would define their next decision. Daniel looked directly at Simone again. If the future of this partnership depends on accountability, he said slowly, then accountability must begin here. The room seemed to lean forward collectively. Marcus Reed felt the shift in the atmosphere immediately. This was no longer a conversation about whether the wine had spilled or who had started the argument. It had become something far larger. Daniel turned toward Victoria once more. You owe Miss Carter a direct apology, he said quietly. Victoria blinked as if she had not heard him correctly. Excuse me, she replied. Daniel's voice did not rise, but the firmness in it was unmistakable. Not a casual one, he said. A real one. The silence that followed felt almost electric. Several guests exchanged stunned looks. No one in the room had expected Daniel Langford to confront his own sister in the middle of a ballroom filled with investors and donors. Victoria's expression shifted rapidly between shock and anger. You cannot be serious, she said. Daniel held her gaze calmly. I am completely serious, he replied. Simone Carter watched quietly, saying nothing. The decision unfolding in front of her was not something she needed to force. It was something Daniel Langford had chosen to do on his own. Victoria exhaled sharply and looked around the room as if hoping someone else would interrupt the moment. But no one did. The crowd had become completely still, every person waiting to see what she would do next. Emily Foster felt her heart beating faster as she watched. Her tablet screen still displayed the same contract status. The system continued waiting. Marcus Reed leaned slightly forward again, unable to look away. Daniel spoke once more, his voice steady. If we expect partners to trust our leadership, he said, then we must prove that respect is not optional within our organization. Victoria looked at Simone Carter again, the reality of the situation finally settling over her. For the first time since the evening began, the confident certainty she had carried into the conversation was completely gone. The room waited in silence as she struggled to find the words, and everyone present understood that the next sentence she spoke might decide the fate of a project worth $2.4 billion. I did not expect the room to become this quiet tonight, Victoria Langford said at last, her voice lower than it had been earlier, the sharp confidence that once carried her words now replaced by something far less certain. The silence that followed her sentence stretched across the ballroom like a thin sheet of glass, fragile enough that every person standing within earshot felt the tension in it. The crystal chandeliers above continued to glow warmly, casting soft reflections across the marble floor and the tall cocktail tables arranged around the room. But the elegance of the setting now felt almost secondary to the moment unfolding beneath it. Simone Carter stood exactly where she had been standing since the beginning of the confrontation, her posture composed, her expression calm, her attention fixed on the woman who only minutes earlier had dismissed her presence without hesitation. The red wine stain across Simone's dress had faded slightly as the fabric dried, yet the mark remained visible enough that no one in the room could forget how the evening had begun. Daniel Langford remained beside his sister, his hands loosely clasped in front of him, the posture of a man who had already chosen his position and was prepared to stand by it. Around them the circle of guests had grown even larger. Some donors had quietly stepped closer. Others remained where they stood but leaned forward slightly, unable to resist witnessing the outcome of a moment that had become far more consequential than anyone expected when they arrived at the gala earlier that evening. Marcus Reed watched from his position near the cocktail table, his expression thoughtful as he studied the scene. In the world of technology startups and venture funding, negotiations often unfolded behind closed doors. Seeing one happen in a ballroom filled with donors and investors felt almost surreal. Emily Foster remained near the edge of the gathering, her tablet still held carefully in both hands. The screen continued to display the same message it had shown for several minutes now. Formal withdrawal pending confirmation. The system waited patiently, unaware of the tension surrounding the decision it represented. Victoria inhaled slowly as if steadying herself before speaking again. "Miss Carter," she said, her voice no longer sharp but controlled. Simone lifted her gaze to meet hers without saying anything. Victoria hesitated for a brief moment, the weight of the entire room pressing quietly around her. For the first time that evening she seemed fully aware of the eyes watching her, of the phones recording from a distance, of the fact that the moment could not simply be dismissed as an awkward misunderstanding anymore. Daniel remained silent beside her. The expectation in his posture made it clear that the responsibility for the next words belonged to her alone. Victoria finally spoke again. "Earlier tonight, I made an assumption," she said slowly. The sentence sounded almost careful, as if she were choosing each word with deliberate caution. Simone did not interrupt. The surrounding guests remained perfectly still. Even the faint clink of glasses from the far end of the ballroom seemed to fade as people leaned closer to listen. Victoria continued. "I believed you did not belong at this event," she said. The statement hung in the air for a moment before she added quietly, "That assumption was wrong." Marcus Reed raised his eyebrows slightly, recognizing the significance of the admission. In many circles, admitting a mistake publicly required more courage than denying it privately. Victoria's shoulders lowered a fraction as she continued speaking. "I allowed that assumption to shape my behavior," she said. "And because of that I treated you with disrespect." The words came more steadily now, though the tension in her voice had not disappeared entirely. Simone Carter remained calm, her attention focused entirely on the apology unfolding in front of her. Emily Foster glanced briefly at her tablet again before looking back toward the center of the room. The contract status had not changed yet. Victoria exhaled slowly before finishing the thought she had begun. "For that," she said, looking directly at Simone, "I sincerely apologize." The ballroom remained silent after the words were spoken. No one clapped. No one spoke. The apology did not resolve the tension immediately. Instead, it created a different kind of quiet, the kind that follows a statement everyone understands but still waits to see how it will be received. Simone Carter studied Victoria Langford for a moment without responding. Her expression did not change, but there was a slight shift in the way she stood, as if she were measuring the sincerity of the moment rather than the words themselves. Daniel Langford watched her carefully. He had already done what he believed necessary to demonstrate accountability. Now the outcome rested entirely with her. Marcus Reed folded his arms again, his attention moving between the three figures standing beneath the chandelier light. From where he stood, the scene looked less like a confrontation now and more like a decision point in a negotiation that had moved through several unexpected phases. Simone finally spoke. Her voice remained calm, but it carried easily through the silent room. Acknowledging a mistake is not easy, she said. Victoria remained still, listening. Simone continued. But accountability does not end with words. The sentence caused several guests to shift slightly where they stood. Daniel Langford nodded faintly, recognizing the principle immediately. In business partnerships, apologies could open the door to resolution, but they rarely closed the conversation entirely. Simone glanced briefly toward Emily Foster across the room. The glow of the tablet screen was visible even from a distance. Then she returned her gaze to Victoria and Daniel. The partnership between our organizations represents a commitment to something larger than either of us individually, she said, which means the standards behind that partnership must be just as visible as the project itself. The words settled over the room with quiet clarity. Victoria lowered her eyes for a moment before looking back at Simone. The confidence she had carried earlier in the evening was gone now, replaced by something closer to humility. Daniel Langford remained silent, allowing Simone the space to finish what she had begun. Simone Carter paused for a moment before continuing. Your apology matters, she said. But the decision in front of us is not only about tonight. Marcus Reed felt the tension return slightly at that sentence. The apology had been offered, but the final outcome still had not been determined. Emily Foster's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of her tablet as she waited for the moment when the system might finally receive the instruction it had been waiting for since the confrontation began. Simone Carter lifted her gaze once more toward Daniel Langford. Her voice remained steady when she spoke again, yet every person in the ballroom understood that the next decision would shape the future of the partnership far beyond the walls of the gala. I appreciate the apology, Simone Carter said quietly, her voice carrying with calm clarity across the ballroom that had now become completely still, the crystal chandeliers above reflecting soft light across the marble floor, while dozens of guests waited for the next words that would determine whether the partnership everyone had heard about for months would survive the night. Simone did not raise her voice, but the weight behind her words held the room in place. Daniel Langford watched her carefully, his posture steady, the expression of a man who had already accepted that the outcome of the evening would depend entirely on the decision standing in front of him. Victoria Langford remained silent beside him, the tension in her shoulders visible even beneath the elegant black evening gown she wore. The earlier confidence that had once filled her voice had disappeared, replaced by the quiet understanding that the moment had moved far beyond a social misunderstanding. Around them, the crowd of investors, donors, and guests had grown so attentive that even the faint music of the string quartet now sounded distant. Marcus Reed leaned slightly forward from his place near the tall cocktail table, studying Simone Carter the way he would study a founder presenting a company worth millions of dollars. Emily Foster remained near the edge of the gathering, holding the tablet that still displayed the contract status message glowing softly on its screen. Formal withdrawal pending confirmation had not changed. The system was still waiting. Simone looked at Daniel Langford with thoughtful calm before continuing. Your sister acknowledged the mistake, she said. Daniel nodded once, accepting the statement without interruption. Simone continued speaking, her tone steady and deliberate. And you demonstrated accountability by asking her to do so publicly. Several guests shifted slightly, recognizing the significance of that observation. In many corporate circles, the instinct was to handle uncomfortable moments quietly behind closed doors. Daniel Langford had chosen the opposite approach. Marcus Reed noticed that detail immediately. It suggested that Daniel understood how much was truly at stake. Simone Carter paused for a moment before speaking again. But a partnership like ours is not measured only by how mistakes are corrected, she said. It is measured by what happens after the correction. The sentence hung quietly in the air. Daniel Langford folded his hands loosely in front of him again, his attention fixed entirely on her. He had spent decades navigating negotiations with city officials, investors, and international partners. Yet this moment carried a different kind of pressure. Numbers could be renegotiated. Reputation required something else entirely. Simone glanced briefly toward the crowd surrounding them. Many of the guests present were donors to the foundation hosting the event, people who had contributed millions of dollars to programs promising opportunity and development across the region. Their faces reflected curiosity, tension, and anticipation all at once. Then Simone returned her attention to Daniel. When Carter Infrastructure agreed to support the transit redevelopment project, she said, "We did so because the plan represented long-term value for the communities it would serve." Daniel inclined his head slightly. "That was our goal as well," he said. Simone acknowledged the response with a small nod before continuing. "Which means the partnership must reflect the same long-term thinking." The clarity in her voice made it impossible to misunderstand what she meant. Around them, several guests exchanged glances again. Marcus Reed could almost see the decision forming behind her eyes. Emily Foster shifted her grip on the tablet slightly as she waited for the moment when the system might finally receive its final instruction. Simone Carter continued speaking. "Earlier tonight, I paused the contract review process," she said. The sentence caused a ripple of quiet movement through the crowd. Everyone present understood that the project she referred to was worth $2.4 billion. Daniel Langford did not react outwardly, though he had already known the pause had happened. Simone continued. "That pause gave me time to consider whether continuing the partnership would still reflect the values behind the project." Victoria Langford lowered her eyes briefly, listening without interrupting. Daniel remained still, waiting. Simone Carter looked at him carefully before finishing the thought she had begun. "And after considering everything that happened tonight," she said calmly, "I have reached a decision." The room seemed to tighten collectively around the words. Marcus Reed felt the shift immediately. Emily Foster glanced down at the tablet screen again, anticipating the moment the contract's status might finally change. Daniel Langford spoke softly before Simone continued. "Whatever decision you make," he said, "we will accept it." The statement was simple but sincere. It carried the tone of a man who understood that respect sometimes required accepting consequences rather than negotiating them away. Simone held his gaze for a moment, measuring the sincerity in his voice. Then she spoke again. "Carter Infrastructure will continue the partnership." The sentence moved through the ballroom like a quiet release of breath. Several guests exhaled audibly. Marcus Reed leaned back slightly, impressed by the calm confidence behind the decision. Emily Foster's tablet vibrated softly in her hands as the contract status updated on the screen. Formal withdrawal pending confirmation disappeared, replaced by partnership review resolved. Simone Carter continued speaking before the reaction in the room could fully settle. "But the partnership will move forward with one condition," she said. Daniel Langford nodded slowly. "Name it," he replied. Simone's voice remained steady. "Every organization connected to the project will participate in a public commitment to professional conduct and respect across all levels of leadership." The request was not dramatic. It was practical, yet the meaning behind it carried weight. Marcus Reed recognized it immediately. Simone was not asking for revenge. She was establishing a standard. Daniel Langford considered the request for only a moment before answering. "That condition is reasonable," he said, "and it will be implemented." The calm certainty in his response caused several investors in the room to nod quietly. Victoria Langford remained silent, but the humility in her expression made it clear she understood the significance of what had just happened. Simone Carter looked around the ballroom one final time. The crowd that had gathered around the confrontation now stood in thoughtful silence, absorbing the resolution they had just witnessed. When she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm strength it had held since the beginning of the evening. "Respect does not weaken partnerships," she said. "It is the only reason they survive." The sentence settled into the room with quiet finality, and every person present understood that the woman who had arrived as an unknown guest had just redefined the tone of a partnership worth billions without raising her voice once. "I believe everyone in this room just witnessed something that rarely happens in business," Marcus Reed said quietly, though his voice carried further than he expected in the ballroom that had only moments ago been filled with tension thick enough to silence every conversation. The words were not meant as a speech, yet they captured the feeling spreading through the crowd beneath the crystal chandeliers. The decision Simone Carter had just made had changed the atmosphere of the entire evening. The tension that had gripped the room since the wine spilled across her dress was finally beginning to loosen, but the impact of the moment had not disappeared. Instead, it had transformed into something else entirely. respect, reflection, and for many people standing in the ballroom, a kind of quiet admiration. Simone Carter remained standing beside the cocktail table, the same place she had been since the beginning of the confrontation. The red wine stain across her dress was still visible under the chandelier light, though now it seemed less like an embarrassment and more like a symbol of the moment that had shifted an entire room. She did not appear triumphant. She did not appear angry. She simply looked composed, the same calm presence she had carried from the beginning. Daniel Langford stood a few feet away, studying her with the expression of someone who understood that the outcome of the evening could have easily gone in a very different direction. He had spent years negotiating complex partnerships, but rarely had one been tested so publicly and so suddenly. Victoria Langford stood beside him, her posture noticeably different than it had been earlier. The arrogance that had once defined her presence had faded. In its place was something quieter, something closer to reflection. Around them, the guests slowly began to breathe again, conversations restarting in careful whispers as people tried to process what they had just witnessed. Several investors exchanged glances that carried the same thought. The woman who had stood silently in the center of the ballroom had just protected a $2.4 billion partnership without raising her voice once. Emily Foster looked down at her tablet again, confirming what she had already seen seconds earlier. The contract status had officially updated. Partnership review resolved. The system now reflected the decision Simone Carter had made. Emily lifted her gaze towards Simone again, feeling a quiet sense of awe at how calmly the entire situation had been handled. Marcus Reed stepped slightly closer, not intruding on the circle, but close enough to speak with the respect he believed the moment deserved. "That was impressive," he said simply. Simone glanced toward him and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. "It was necessary," she replied. The answer was not boastful. It was practical. Marcus smiled slightly, recognizing the difference immediately. People who built companies rarely thought in terms of dramatic victories. They thought in terms of decisions that shaped the future. Daniel Langford turned toward the guests gathered around them. His voice carried with the calm authority that had built his reputation over decades. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "tonight was meant to celebrate community investment and long-term development. I believe what just happened reflects those values more clearly than any prepared speech could have." A few guests nodded quietly. The line did not feel like a public relations statement. It felt like an honest recognition of what everyone had seen. Daniel then looked back towards Simone Carter. "Miss Carter," he said, "your condition regarding the public commitment to professional conduct will be implemented immediately." Simone inclined her head slightly. "I appreciate that," she replied. Victoria Langford stepped forward slowly, her movements more measured than before. The confidence she once used to command the room had been replaced by a different kind of presence, one shaped by humility. She looked directly at Simone. "I meant what I said earlier," Victoria said quietly. "I was wrong about you." Simone studied her for a moment before responding. "What matters is what happens after that realization," she said calmly. Victoria nodded once, accepting the truth in the statement without argument. The surrounding guests watched the exchange with quiet attention. The moment did not feel theatrical anymore. It felt sincere. Marcus Reed glanced toward Emily Foster, who still held the tablet. "Everything good now?" he asked softly. Emily nodded. "Yes," she said. "The partnership is active again." Marcus looked back toward Simone Carter, clearly impressed. "You protected the deal and raised the standard at the same time," he said. Simone gave a faint smile, though it was subtle enough that most people would not notice it. "Standards should never depend on the situation," she replied. The sentence resonated with several people standing nearby. Investors who had spent years building companies understood the truth behind it. Daniel Langford extended his hand toward Simone Carter. "Then I believe our work continues," he said. Simone shook his hand calmly. "Yes," she said. "It does." The gesture felt simple, yet everyone present understood the significance of it. The partnership between their companies had survived its most unexpected test. Around them, the ballroom slowly returned to life. Conversations resumed. The musicians continued playing. Waiters moved through the room again with trays of drinks and small plates. Yet the energy of the event had changed. The story people would tell about the evening would not be about the silent auction or the speeches. It would be about the moment a quiet decision reshaped the tone of an entire room. Emily Foster finally lowered her tablet, the tension she had been carrying throughout the confrontation leaving her shoulders. Marcus Reed leaned back against the cocktail table again, watching Simone Carter as she picked up the champagne glass she had set aside earlier. She took a small sip, her posture relaxed but her presence still commanding. Victoria Langford watched her for a moment before speaking again. "You handled that with remarkable patience," she said. Simone set the glass back on the table. "Patience is easier when you know exactly who you are," she replied. The simplicity of the answer left Victoria silent for a moment. Across the ballroom, several guests continued discussing the scene they had just witnessed. Some spoke about leadership, others about accountability. But nearly everyone agreed on one thing. The woman who had stood quietly beneath the chandelier lights had changed the tone of the entire evening. And she had done it without anger, without shouting, and without ever needing to prove her worth with anything other than calm confidence. The ballroom slowly regained its rhythm after the moment that had held every guest in silence only minutes earlier, yet the atmosphere had changed in a way that could not be reversed. Conversations returned, but they carried a different tone now. People were not discussing the charity auction items, or the menu, or the evening's entertainment. They were discussing what they had just witnessed. Beneath the glow of the chandeliers and the quiet sweep of violin strings, the story had already begun traveling through the room in small clusters of conversation. Simone Carter stood near the cocktail table where she had been for most of the evening, her posture relaxed yet unmistakably composed. The stain of red wine remained across the front of her dress, though now it felt less like a stain and more like a reminder of the moment that had revealed far more about the room than anyone had expected. She lifted the champagne glass again, taking a small sip before setting it gently back down on the table. Across the room, Daniel Langford spoke quietly with two investors who had approached him moments after the partnership decision was announced. His posture was calm but attentive, the expression of someone who understood that the story of the evening would extend far beyond the walls of the ballroom. Victoria Langford stood several feet away, listening to the conversation around her with a thoughtful quietness that would have surprised anyone who had seen her earlier in the night. The shift in her demeanor was unmistakable. She no longer tried to command attention. Instead, she seemed to be absorbing the moment, the consequences of it, and the lesson that had arrived with it. Marcus Reed stepped closer to the table where Simone stood, still impressed by the calm authority she had carried through the entire confrontation. "I imagine most people in your position would have walked out of the room tonight," he said. Simone glanced toward him with a faint smile that carried more reflection than pride. "Walking away would have been easier," she replied. Marcus nodded. "But easier is rarely the option people choose when they are responsible for something bigger than themselves," he said. Simone did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked out across the ballroom where donors, executives, and guests had begun speaking more openly again. A few of them glanced toward her with expressions that ranged from admiration to curiosity. Some nodded respectfully when their eyes met hers. The room had clearly decided who had held the true authority in the situation. Emily Foster approached quietly from the side, the tablet still in her hands, though her shoulders finally looked relaxed for the first time since the confrontation began. "Miss Carter," she said softly. Simone turned toward her. Emily hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I just wanted to say that I have coordinated dozens of events here over the years," she said. "And I have never seen someone handle a situation like that the way you did tonight." Simone inclined her head slightly. "Thank you," she said. Emily looked briefly toward the crowd again. "You could have ended the partnership," she said carefully. Simone considered the statement for a moment before answering. "Yes," she said. Emily studied her expression. "Why did you choose not to?" she asked. Simone rested one hand lightly on the edge of the table as she spoke. "Because the project itself matters," she replied. The answer came without hesitation. "Millions of people will depend on the transportation network that partnership is meant to build." Emily nodded slowly. The simplicity of the explanation carried a quiet weight. Marcus Reed folded his arms thoughtfully. "So the decision was not about the money," he said. Simone looked toward him. "Money is a measurement," she replied calmly. "Impact is a responsibility." The sentence lingered in the air long enough that both Marcus and Emily understood the deeper meaning behind it. Across the ballroom, Daniel Langford finished his conversation with the investors and walked back towards Simone with a measured pace. Several guests stepped slightly aside to allow him through, the path opening naturally without anyone being asked to move. He stopped a few feet from Simone and offered a small nod of acknowledgement. It appears the evening will be remembered for reasons none of us planned, he said. Simone gave a faint smile. Sometimes those are the moments people learn the most from, she replied. Daniel glanced briefly at the wine stain still visible on her dress. My sister's behavior created a situation that should not have happened, he said. Simone's expression remained calm. But it did, she replied. Daniel accepted the statement without argument. And because it did, he said, it forced everyone in this room to decide what kind of standards they actually believe in. Simone nodded once. The surrounding guests continued their quiet conversations, though many of them still kept one eye on the exchange between the two executives. Marcus Reed stepped slightly back, sensing that the conversation between them carried a different kind of weight now. Daniel looked toward the ballroom for a moment before speaking again. The commitment you requested earlier will begin tomorrow, he said. Every partner organization connected to the redevelopment project will receive the new professional conduct framework. Simone acknowledged the statement with a small nod. That will strengthen the partnership, she said. Daniel allowed himself a faint smile. And it will remind everyone involved that leadership is measured by behavior as much as by results. Victoria Langford approached slowly from behind him, her steps measured but purposeful. She stopped a short distance away from Simone and looked at her again with quiet sincerity. I will remember tonight for a very long time, Victoria said. Simone studied her expression for a moment before responding. Most important lessons arrive in unexpected moments, she replied. Victoria nodded once. The response carried no defensiveness, only acceptance. Across the ballroom, the music shifted into a softer melody as the evening continued. Waiters moved through the crowd with fresh trays of drinks, and the auction coordinator began preparing the next presentation. Yet the energy of the room remained subtly different than it had been earlier. The guests who had witnessed the confrontation now spoke with a deeper awareness of what leadership actually looked like when tested. Simone Carter picked up her champagne glass again and looked across the ballroom once more. The night had returned to its elegant rhythm, but the quiet impact of the moment lingered in every corner of the room. Without raising her voice, without demanding recognition, and without stepping away from the responsibility of the decision in front of her, she had shown everyone present that true authority rarely announces itself. It simply reveals itself when the moment arrives. I learned something important tonight, Simone Carter said quietly as the music in the ballroom drifted into a softer melody and the evening slowly returned to its elegant rhythm. Yet the weight of what had happened continued to echo through the conversations around the room. The crystal chandeliers above cast warm light across the polished marble floor, while groups of donors and investors spoke in quieter tones than they had earlier in the evening. Many of them still glanced occasionally toward the woman standing near the cocktail table, the same woman who only an hour earlier had been treated like someone who did not belong in the room. Simone rested her fingertips lightly against the stem of her champagne glass, the faint red stain across the front of her dress still visible beneath the golden light. She had not tried to hide it. In a way, it had become part of the evening's story. Marcus Reed stood a few feet away, listening as she spoke. Emily Foster remained nearby as well, her tablet finally lowered to her side after hours of tension that had only recently begun to fade. Daniel Langford and Victoria Langford stood together across from Simone, their expressions thoughtful as the room gradually returned to its earlier rhythm. Simone looked around the ballroom slowly, taking in the faces of the guests who had witnessed everything from the beginning. Some nodded respectfully when her eyes passed over them. Others looked thoughtful, as if replaying the moment in their minds and realizing how easily the situation could have ended very differently. Moments like this remind people what leadership actually looks like, Marcus Reed said quietly. Simone turned toward him. Leadership is not about controlling the room, she replied calmly. It is about knowing when the room needs a different direction. The sentence carried a quiet strength that made both Marcus and Emily nod in agreement. Daniel Langford stepped slightly closer, the calm professionalism he had carried throughout the evening now accompanied by a visible respect for the woman standing in front of him. I suspect the story of tonight will travel far beyond this ballroom, he said. Simone gave a faint smile. Stories always travel, she replied. What matters is what they teach the people who hear them. Victoria Langford looked at her again, the earlier arrogance completely replaced by a reflective calm. You could have destroyed the partnership tonight, Victoria said. Simone studied her expression for a moment before answering. I could have, she said simply. Victoria hesitated before asking the question that had clearly been forming in her mind. But you chose not to, she said. Simone nodded. Because leadership is not about proving power, she replied. It is about deciding how that power should be used. The quiet clarity of the statement settled into the air around them. Emily Foster glanced across the ballroom where the musicians continued playing and the waitstaff carried trays between the tables. The event itself had resumed, yet the tone of the room had permanently shifted. Guests who had arrived expecting a routine evening of speeches and networking had instead witnessed a lesson in accountability and composure that none of them would forget. Marcus Reed folded his arms thoughtfully as he looked around the ballroom again. I have seen founders lose billion-dollar deals over arguments smaller than what happened tonight, he said. Simone lifted her champagne glass and took a small sip before responding. Because they were trying to win the argument, she said. Marcus smiled slightly. And you were trying to protect the outcome, he replied. Simone set the glass gently back on the table. Exactly. Daniel Langford nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in the exchange. That difference, he said, is why the partnership survived. Victoria looked toward the stain on Simone's dress again before speaking. I imagine most people would have left the moment that happened, she said. Simone glanced down at the fabric briefly before lifting her gaze again. Walking away might have felt satisfying for a few minutes, she said calmly. But the consequences of that choice would have lasted for decades. The sentence carried a quiet gravity that made everyone standing near her pause for a moment. The transit redevelopment project would indeed shape transportation for millions of people across the region. Simone Carter had chosen to think about that future rather than the discomfort of a single moment. Marcus Reed exhaled slowly, clearly impressed. That kind of thinking is why companies like yours exist, he said. Simone shook her head gently. That kind of thinking is why they survive, she replied. Around them the ballroom continued its slow return to celebration. Laughter began to reappear in small pockets of conversation. The musicians shifted into a brighter arrangement. Yet the atmosphere still carried a quiet awareness that the evening had revealed something deeper than any speech on the program. Emily Foster looked toward Simone again. People are going to remember what you did tonight, she said. Simone considered the statement for a moment before answering. I hope they remember something else instead, she replied. Emily raised an eyebrow slightly. What is that? She asked. Simone looked around the ballroom one final time before responding. That respect should never depend on appearances, she said. The sentence lingered in the air with a calm certainty that felt stronger than any applause. Daniel Langford nodded slowly. Victoria remained quiet, absorbing the meaning behind the words. Marcus Reed smiled faintly as he looked across the room once more. The story of the evening had already begun to spread among the guests, and by the time the night ended it would likely reach far beyond the ballroom itself. Yet the most important part of the story was not the spilled wine or the tense confrontation that followed. It was the way one woman had responded to it. Simone Carter lifted her champagne glass one last time, the faint stain on her dress still visible beneath the chandelier light. Her voice remained calm when she spoke again, yet every person standing near her understood the message behind the final words she offered. Power does not need to shout, she said quietly. It only needs to know when to stand still.